Chapter 1.
Analysis complete, Holtz, or Captain Mitsumi. We have no sign of activity within the 5,000-year time horizon.
On the main screen, an orange and brown sphere turned, set against a black velvet backdrop just visible at the screen's edges. Doom was written at the bottom of the screen.
Thank you, Guilhem. I can still read.
His lips compressed into a flat line. Mitsumi closed his eyes, shutting out failure, struggling to keep his head above a rising tide of disappointment. This was simply not possible. Everything he had, and a good slug of credits he didn't, rode on this. Mitsumi opened his eyes and riveted them on the unnamed planet's surface, willing the telltale impact craters into existence. None appeared. On the screen's lower section, the glowing text remained stubbornly unchanged.
GV3321950993, P4G negative for recent strikes.
Suspended next to his pilot, Holtz Mitsumi was unwilling to admit that his last chance had come up empty. This can't be it, Mitsumi thought. What will I tell my backers? Through the tumult and nastiness, they'd stuck with him, taken his side even, and given him this last run. They deserved better than utter failure. They merited at least some success, even if it wouldn't repay them entirely. How could he face them empty-handed? But the prospect of facing his backers paled beside the ultimate horror. What if his ex-wives found out? He cringed, blood flowing to his cheeks. Their jeers and mocking laughter, imagined in exquisite and all too realistic detail, echoing in his head. His information source had been so confident. Yet at planet after planet, the computer had thrown the same words in his face.
Negative for recent strikes.
And this was it. The last stop. Something had to be there. Mitsumi ran a hand along his smooth, jet-black hair and grabbed the knot of hair at the back of his head, thinking of possibilities.
Perhaps the computer missed something,
he mused, his voice tailing upward in hope. Pym snorted in disgust. Mitsumi lowered his hand. I get it, Pym, he thought. But I need a break and the universe owes me one.
It tests at...
Guilhem began.
99% accuracy.
Mitsumi finished, acknowledging how unlikely his speculation was. 99%. Almost impossible odds. Similar, though, to the odds against his advancement in the Navy from training cadet to second just below captain. And he'd made that happen.
I get it. Still.
Still what?
Pym demanded, his face set in defiance.
Nothing's there, Holtz. It's time to go home.
Mitsumi eyed Pym. When the crew uses your first name, you have lost your command. And that was something he was familiar with. So Pym didn't want to waste any more time and resources on a 1 in a million bet on either a computer error or being the first exception to the rule.
Guilhem?
Mitsumi said, addressing his pilot.
Should we drop down the well? Look for ourselves?
Guilhem flicked his eyes at Pym and licked his lips.
Well, I suppose it wouldn't do any harm.
Oh, come on, Guilhem.
Pym demanded, throwing his hands in the air.
You can't be serious. A year we've been out here, chasing Holtz's leads.
That's Captain Mitsumi,
Mitsumi said, allowing his irritation to show. Pym sneered, ignoring Mitsumi.
Solid leads, he told us. Finds as spectacular as Sunderids, he said. Well, that worked out, didn't it?
Eyes fixed on the screen before him, Mitsumi set his face, forcing disappointment from his mind. He refused to admit defeat. His source had been impeccable and had promised decent, if not spectacular, finds on this run. Perhaps he'd raised unreasonable expectations, but he couldn't go back empty-handed until he'd explored every avenue.
Okay, say the computer's right.
Mitsumi gestured toward the screen.
No recent strikes. But maybe the pattern won't hold. This might be the exception.
Guilhem sighed and lowered his head, clearly embarrassed at Mitsumi's suggestion.
Oh, here we go,
Pym said. He knew how it sounded. Odds weren't good betting on an exception that had for 20 years been an unbroken rule. Still, The rule wasn't a fundamental physical constant. It was just a statistic.
It's possible.
Mitsumi said, desperate to make his point and convince Gwilym to vote to stay and investigate.
We've discovered only 10 dead first Civ planets in the 20 years since Sundered's find.
With an incredulous look on his face, Pym shook his head as soon as Mitsumi spoke. And they all fit the pattern. Holtz, significant impact cratering within 5,000 Uniform Federation years. Not to mention the 200 explored planets without cratering and with no first Civ traces. And where would you look anyway? That's a whole planet down there. We can't...
Captain Mitsumi.
Gwilym nodded at the screen. The text superimposed on the planet had changed.
GV321950993 P4G. Anomalies detected. 40.234, 119.345, 42.342, 118.481.
Mitsumi's heart beat a little faster. This might be it. Maybe the pattern didn't hold. Maybe his luck had changed. Anomalies. Those might be first Civ remnants despite the crater's absence.
Let's start there,
Mitsumi said, indicating the screen.
It's just alien ruins.
Pym scoffed. Mitsumi's shoulders slumped and his spirits sagged. Pym was almost certainly right. Since venturing out again among the stars at the end of the Great Dark, human beings had never found aliens, only their fallen civilization's ruins, and no one had recovered anything useful from those ruins.
Look,
Pym said.
We can sell the location. An institute will pay us. It'll net less than our costs. The trip's still a loss, but let's not hang around and make it bigger.
Deflated, but not willing to give up, Mitsumi considered the image on the screen. Pym had a point, but Mitsumi wouldn't surrender while hope glowed on the screen. Anomalies found. He clenched his jaw, preparing himself for the reaction.
We should investigate,
Mitsumi said, trying to force steel into his voice.
We might find something worth more than the location. You never know, and we're here.
Pym shook his head in disgust.
I vote no.
Gwilym?
Mitsumi asked, still staring at the screen, resisting the urge to cave to Pym. Pym glared at Gwilym, daring him to disagree.
I don't know, Ho. Captain, I think Pym may be right.
Mitsumi lowered his head, his resolve softening as disappointment and despair made an unwelcome reappearance. Pym and Gwilym were right. Nothing was there. Perhaps that was for the best. Give up the impossible dream. Face his backer's disappointment, find an anonymous post on a freighter and disappear. It would be another rung down as he descended the ladder of success. But hey, he was looking at it wrong. To be positive, he was climbing, making his way up the ladder of failure. Should he feel better being an accomplished loser? He might as well skip the next few steps and go straight to the part where he was planet-bound, starving and alone. Of course, he could always go home, live off one of his siblings or his parents. Unable to shift his eyes from the view screen, he marveled at the thoroughness of his reversal. Everything had been clear space and tight jumps only a few years ago. He'd been second on a Federated World starship, married to the gorgeous love of his life, on the brink of a brilliant career. Now, he was a 40-year-old failed prospector, staring at a welcome home son sign strung over the steps to his parents' basement. It hadn't happened all at once. First, there had been the fiasco with his wife that ended his marriage and his stint in the Navy. So he had started over new marriage, new career in the commercial ranks, only to have both end the same way. What were the odds? Among his earliest memories, he couldn't have been more than 5 at the time. He stood in a park on the city's outskirts, staring through half-closed eyes as shuttles from the spaceport speared into the cloudless emerald sky on blinding flame to the tune of deep, rolling, shaking thunder. That had been his dream, riding that flame and jumping to the stars, and for a fleeting, sparkling moment, he'd made it. But now as the power guttered out, he felt himself falling down the gravity well.
Wow, anomalies, but no recent craters, so aliens, right?
Kalal Deo drifted across the access tube to the bridge, his observation dragging Mitsumi from his morass of self-pity.
We're leaving,
Pym said, glowering at Kalal.
We'll sell the location and recoup part of our losses, but we're leaving now. That's what we decided, right, Holtz?
With a skeptical look, Kalal considered Pym, then turned to Mitsumi.
Is that right, Captain Mitsumi? Is that your decision? Because I'd like to see alien ruins up close and personal.
Uncertain now, Mitsumi glanced from Kalal to Pym. Kalal's enthusiasm thinned Mitsumi's disappointment. The chance to explore actual alien ruins was enticing. Pym was right, though. Every minute they spent here increased their losses, and the odds of uncovering anything of value in alien ruins were long. Mitsumi dithered, indecision paralyzing him. Kalal tapped his chest.
I think we should visit these sites.
He shrugged.
But if you tell me we're leaving, well, you're the captain, so I guess we'll leave.
We've decided?
Pym began. Kalal cut him off with a gesture.
Captain Mitsumi?
Kalal said. Mitsumi nodded at Kalal, acknowledging his lifeline.
It seems we're at loggerheads.
Mitsumi said.
I would like to stay and explore, as you suggest, but Gwillem and Pym want to leave, so...
So you're the captain?
Kalal said, fixing his eyes on Pym.
In charge of this expedition.
And that is true, Mitsumi thought. Although at times it hadn't felt like it, and he hated making decisions that upset anyone. But he'd upset someone, no matter what his decision. Gwillem and Pym might be right, but he couldn't bring himself to concede defeat yet. Mitsumi reached deep inside and hauled up what courage he found there as a bulwark against Pym's anger, even as he was upset at his weakness.
We're staying and exploring,
Mitsumi announced with as much force as he could muster, hoping his cringe wasn't as obvious as it felt. Pym smacked his console in disgust.
You're insane,
he said.
That's not a rational decision.
Kalal smiled and nodded in approval.
I'll prep the shuttle.
He should take the victory and walk away, but he couldn't do it.
It won't take long, Pym,
Mitsumi said, attempting to placate Pym, repelled by his need to do so.
A few days at most.
Fine.
Pym spat.
But the extra cost is coming from your pocket.
At touchdown, the shuttle's fusion drive kicked up huge dust clouds before they were close enough to fuse the soil. Analysis from orbit had shown the atmosphere's composition lacked sufficient oxygen, but was of adequate pressure, and the temperature was at the higher end of acceptable, so a breathing mask covering his nose and his mouth were the only accommodation required on the surface. New high-end models, the masks were a permeable material that passed nitrogen and oxygen in the correct levels while excluding anything else. One technology derived from a recent first Civ find. Why couldn't I have their luck? Mitsumi thought, putting on his mask. Those guys made out like bandits. The outer airlock door opened, and they descended the ramp to the surface. They had landed at the first set of coordinates the computer had identified as containing an anomaly regular patterns on the surface, indicating artificial rather than natural formations. That put them in a broad valley between low rounded hills. Flat, brown, and gray, the valley was unrelieved by anything suggesting life. Ruins, brown and gray matching the colors in the valley, lay in front of them. The planet Star, a red giant taking up a good chunk of the sky, hung overhead. Two of the planet's 3 moons floated, silhouetted against the star's surface. The sky, a blue-green dome, stretched cloudless from horizon to horizon. A stiff breeze blew through the valley, hissing along the ground. Occasional stronger gusts swirled up dust and grit and sent it whipping through the air, layering his exposed skin with grime, stinging his hands and arms, and drawing tears from his blinking eyes. The wind pushed traces of atmosphere around an imperfect seal at one of the mask's edges. Sulfur-tinged air wrinkled his nose, and a few dust motes almost prompted a sneeze. On the plus side, the breeze cooled Mitsumi, evaporating sweat that had sprung up the moment he set foot outside. Kalal strolled toward the site. Mitsumi followed along with Gwillem, enjoying the powerful sensation of walking on a world with gravity a touch lower than Nuom, his birth planet. Pym hung back, flaunting his lack of interest. Kalal surveyed the buildings, eyes squinting in concentration.
They're Caliban,
He said.
not Noric or Hentel.
Mitsumi noted the similarity now that Kalal mentioned it.
It's the style that tells, not the colors, because the colors vary with the planet's soil composition.
Kalal added. He had walked up to a building and was rubbing his hand along a wall's surface. In front of Mitsumi, structures curved up from the ground as if they had grown from the soil. The outlying formations were the height of a human two-story building. From the soil, the walls curved outward, then back together, stopping well short of meeting again at the top. They then rose straight for 1 meter. On top of that structure rested a cube whose outer walls reached the limit of the curved walls below. The result looked like a box on top of a sphere. The surfaces were pitted and worn from age, but at least half the buildings were complete, the others having fallen in on themselves through the eons. Caliban ruins, so called because humans first discovered ruins of this type on Caliban's world had been cataloged on 10 different planets. As far as anyone had discovered, the Caliban had left nothing significant behind. Only these oddly shaped buildings. Exploratory expeditions had recovered only bits and pieces of metal, ceramic or other commonplace materials with unguessable functions. Other than a few unfathomable symbols, no writing, sculptures, pictures, or anything resembling art had ever been discovered. The same was true of the older ruins of the Noric and Hentel, even older civilizations named for their discoverers. Whatever had befallen the Caliban, Noric and Hentel differed from the human first civ's fate. Whoever or whatever had pounded the first human stellar civilization into oblivion had left precious few ruins standing.
You know?
Kalal said, laying his hand flat against a wall.
No one's figured out what they did to the soil to form it into such a durable material. If these are Caliban, they date from 1 million UFY ago.
1 million years, Mitsumi thought. No one in the Federated Worlds built anything that would last even 50 Universal Federation years without constant maintenance. Kalal ducked into the structure he'd been examining. Mitsumi turned away and ventured a head deeper into the site among the buildings. He couldn't see Gwillem. He activated the comm in his ear.
Gwillem,
Yes, Holtz?
just checking in.
Mitsumi said.
I lost track of you.
I'm in a building. Haven't seen anything yet.
Okay, let me know if that changes.
Past the outer circle of low-level buildings, the ruins added another sphere on top of the cube, increasing their height to a 3-story human building. As Mitsumi explored the buildings, 1 million years settled on his shoulders, slowing his steps despite his resolve to remain unaffected and concentrate on the task at hand. He wandered into an alley, reaching out and tracing his fingertips along the walls to either side of him. Shadow slanted across the alley. With his head in the sun, the shadowed side was almost impenetrable. He felt the rough wall on his fingers, but could barely make it out. Who had lived here? What had the Caliban been like? In his mind's eye, as if the walls called them forth. Alien children, small 5-legged beings with tentacle arms, chased each other ahead of him, flashing in and out of the sun, their alien laughter echoing down the alley. No one had any idea what they'd look like, of course, but that meant his guess was as good as another's. He had expected sterile age from the ruins, but they weren't sterile. Ancient? Certainly. But sterile? Millennia had degraded but not eliminated the life impressed on the walls. Immersives he'd run on other Caliban ruins failed utterly to convey the sense of the place. When he was growing up on Nuom, his father would take their family on camping trips to the wild places of sheer cliffs and sudden peaks where just under a layer of green life, the Horde's destruction was still raw. There, after nightfall in the flickering firelight, his father would tell old stories from the great dark that spoke of spirits lingering in places they had known in life. He stopped, pressed his hand against one gritty wall, and wondered if the beings who built this place told similar stories out in the wilderness, in the dark. A crunch came from behind him. He whirled, hands scrabbling for his flechette gun and pointing it at nothing. But there on the ground, He saw a chunk of wall material. It looked like a piece from high above had separated and hit the ground. Embarrassed at his reaction, he scanned the alley, making sure no one had seen the spectacle, and hid his mask as he tried to wipe sweat from his upper lip with the back of a trembling hand. Even more chagrined at having forgotten about the mask, he holstered his weapon. Mitsumi shook off his nerves and proceeded farther into the ruins. Mitsumi wandered through the least damaged buildings into various sized rooms with ceilings of different heights. Standardized interiors hadn't seemed to be a priority to the Caliban. A room with a ceiling well over 2 meters tall adjoined one with a 1-meter ceiling. On staircases, the rise from one tread to another varied at random. These discrepancies made what at first could appear normal human structures completely alien. He stopped again and reveled in the strangeness surrounding him. This was why he wanted to be among the stars. Nothing on his home planet Nuome compared to the feeling of discovery when he made planet, and under a strange star's spectrum, his skin glowed aqua, and the air smelled of ripe peaches and mold, where under a different gravity, your entire body thrummed with the knowledge you didn't belong. Once on leave at home before he'd married, he'd tried explaining the sensation to Psycho, his older sister. But holding a year-old daughter on her hip, she'd smiled and rubbed his navy reg baldness. I know we used to tease you for your dream of exploring the bright dark. I don't understand, and it's not for me. But I'm glad you made it out there. Only Tuan, his younger brother, had understood his dream. Tuan, who was now irretrievably lost. Grief at the loss knifed into his gut. A gust of wind threw more grit into his eyes and brought him to the present. After clearing his vision, Mitsumi surveyed his surroundings. Based on the view they'd had approaching the site in the shuttle, he estimated he was close to the center of the rough circle of structures they'd observed.
Gwilym, Kalal, you seen anything?
Mitsumi sent as he turned to the left.
Nope.
Nothing.
Gwilym and Kalal said at once.
How about you, Captain?
Kalal asked.
Nothing here.
Mitsumi said, trying to keep disappointment from his voice.
Haven't you guys given up yet?
Pim said.
Why don't you admit defeat? Come on, let's lift and jump.
If you've nothing to add, Pim.
Kalal said, almost growling.
Shut up and leave us be. We'll go when we're finished, not before.
I am contributing.
Pim said.
I'm contributing sense to this ridiculous search.
Mitsumi wandered through the site along broad avenues that connected to narrow passages, always moving toward the site's center, without success. From one of the narrower alleys he'd encountered, Mitsumi emerged into an open space he would have called a plaza in a human city. An intact, single-story building stood in the center. Straight walls emerged from the ground capped by a dome. The walls and roof were a dark gray and smooth with no evidence of weathering as on the surrounding buildings. In front of him, the doorless entrance to the building revealed only impenetrable black from the darkened interior. The darkness was so profound, it seemed palpable as if he might grab handfuls of the stuff. Wind moaned and whistled through the abandoned structures, raising the hair on his arms and the back of his neck. A tremor of fear racked his body. With a sudden gust, the wind seemed to push him toward the entrance's tangible blackness. Irritated at himself for anthropomorphizing an atmospheric temperature differential and a simple absence of light and allowing it to spook him, Mitsumi shrugged off his apprehension and approached the building, moving with caution despite his attempts at enforcing calm. Really, he told himself, the structure wasn't the least menacing. True, it was unlike everything surrounding it, but that didn't make it dangerous. Maybe his luck had changed at last, and inside he'd find a fabulous life-altering treasure. That would be good. Another wind gust wailed through the surrounding buildings and forced him to step forward and catch himself. He stopped, eyes fixed on the darkness, heart suddenly hammering his chest. But the difference in appearance between this and the other structures might be bad. Its unique design could be purposeful, tagging it as off-limits, because it housed an evil presence that had escaped and annihilated the entire Caliban race beginning right here. He lifted his hand, smoothed his hair, and gripped the hair knotted at the back. While trying to work saliva into his cotton mouth, he lectured himself. Get a grip. Are you listening to yourself? You sound insane. With an effort, he forced thoughts of supernatural aliens aside. He had faced the unknown before without any such qualms. Mitsumi took a step forward, then another, advancing toward the entrance while fighting an increasing dread weighing his limbs and slowing his steps